Amsterdam.
South America.
Vietnam.
Thailand.
China.
Mexico.
I would say primarily outside the U.S.
American children are bought and sold in prostitution here in the United States. It doesn't just happen in other countries.
I think of the criminal act of capturing people.
And they get drugged and put in vans.
They're kidnapped.
Fake advertisements for, models, that kind of thing, and then they just are intimidated or beaten and taken away, I guess.
American kids from all different backgrounds have been and can be victimized in prostitution, although frequently they are kids who are from a foster care background, who have abuse and neglect in their family history, or are runaway and homeless children living on the street. These are kids who it is really easy for pimps and traffickers to recruit and force into prostitution.
Mostly girls.
Little girls that are taken in vans from other countries.
Generally underprivileged women.
Boys are sexually exploited too in the United States, perhaps in the same percentages that girls are exploited. We need more research on the subject, but the bottom line is that boys are sex trafficked in the U.S. too. For over 20 years, ECPAT USA has been working to make sure that no child is bought and sold and used for sex, because it happens here too. Please visit our website, ecpatusa.org, and find out how you can join us in the fight to end child sex trafficking.
Here in Wichita, Kansas, typically when a young woman's picked up and she's rescued, or it's found out that she's involved in some form of sexual exploitation, she'll receive a full entire health check from a special SANE SART program, a nurse examination program regarding her sexual exploitation. She will be working with law enforcement on the prosecution and investigation side. She'll be offered housing services here through the Wichita Children's Home. So again, she'll be offered a lot of services and will not be charged with prostitution. There's state laws to, again, treat her as a survivor and prosecute the perpetrator. I think that it's important to understand, again, some of those commonalities of young people who are survivors of sexual exploitation, just so that we can be more preventative. So basically, in terms of all of our research that we've done, we have found that there's 9 major risk constructs, and that is emotional safety, physical safety, sexual safety, substance abuse and addiction, a young person's schema or worldview, the way that they see themselves as well as the world, family stressors, risk-taking behaviors, and basic needs, as well as some other psychophysiological risk constructs. I definitely believe that the longer that they're involved in sexual exploitation, the more difficult it is for them to leave sexual exploitation. They're then at risk for really being addicted to different forms of drugs. They have a hard time creating bonds and attaching to others and having healthy relationships in the future. There's a lot of psychological effects from depression to post-traumatic stress disorder. High rates of suicide. We also know that a lot of young women who are involved in sexual exploitation then have their own children. And there is a biological response to sexual exploitation that is then transferred to her child. So it's then difficult for her to attach to her own child, and then that child has trauma and psychological damage as well. So we just oftentimes look at the symptoms of one young person and say, they were sexually exploited, look at her behaviors. But what we're not really addressing appropriately is that there truly is a biopsychosocial effect of sexual exploitation that's very long-term, and we have to provide very in-depth trauma-informed services. A really big thing that I have in particular been working on over the last several years is creating a risk and resiliency assessment. So every young person who comes through our Wichita Children's Home or the juvenile detention facility, the goal is that they would all receive this risk and resiliency assessment so that we can identify different levels of past risk factors or vulnerabilities that may have happened to them that may cause them to be more susceptible to becoming involved in sexual exploitation, as well as that this assessment would identify what strengths, resources, and assets that young person already obtained so that we can use those strengths and resources in interventions to reduce the risk of them becoming involved in sexual exploitation.
Public health has been used for many years, since the beginning of the 19th century, for helping stigmatized, marginalized, and hidden populations. In this case, who we're trying to help are sexually exploited youth. And as we've talked about, those youth are often hidden in our society, although they're right in front of us. So using a public health model or a nurse practitioner is allowing us to respond to youth on an individual, on a family, and on a community basis. The Runaway Intervention Program works by assigning each teen that is identified as being sexually exploited an advanced nurse practitioner who follows that teen from the very first time they are assessed in our child abuse clinic and for the next year. So initially the nurse practitioner will see and meet with that teen every single week. And then the teen also, once they've been seen, has access to a youth empowerment group or a therapy group. And so within even the same week that a teen is found, they have a nurse practitioner who is following them wherever they're going to be living, and they have access to this therapy group. So the teen can sort of have 2 therapeutic touches in a single week. And that continues for the first 3 months that the teen is in the program. Program, we've tried to be very good at assessing the types of trauma the teens have experienced when they come into the program and how the program intervenes and changes risk behavior, but also what's happening in the terms of building resiliency in youth in order to decrease risk behavior over the long haul. In our program over the last 5 years, we've assessed 827 teens for sexual abuse when they had, in the setting where they had run away from home. In 200 of those cases, we have found the most severe sexual abuse, which would include sexual exploitation, being gang raped, or being assaulted, sexually assaulted multiple times by different people over a period of time where the teen has run away from home. The cost of the program is about $2,500 to $3,000 per youth, and that provides a year of service. We've become very committed to that. This is not a short-term fix. This is not 6 sessions of therapy. This is not just a 30-day inpatient treatment for substance abuse. That the treatment needs to be holistic. We provide it in a public health model, and it needs to be over a period of a year. And our outcomes really suggest that in the first 3 months that we follow teens, that their level of emotional distress actually does not decrease all that much. But we see our biggest gains at about the 6-month mark, and at 12 months, those gains stabilize and even have increased some. So that at the end of 12 months, if you compare the kids that we're seeing who have been horribly abused and exploited and hurt and traumatized, and you compare those to the teens in Minnesota who are attending school, what we find is that they become nearly indistinguishable.
When I provide training to street outreach programs across the country, my presentation is titled Relationship Violence, or Sexual Exploitation, the New Relationship Violence Among Runaway and Homeless Youth. Because when our young people are involved in sexual exploitation, they often view that perpetrator as their boyfriend, as their caretaker, because they're so vulnerable when they're on the streets that this person can maintain control and definitely say, I'm your boyfriend and you need me, but they're homeless. And regardless, that perpetrator is still their pimp. So definitely, sexual exploitation is a form of relationship violence among runaway and homeless youth. And runaway and homeless youth are particularly susceptible to sexual exploitation because oftentimes, again, many of them struggle with mental health concerns. They're isolated. They're not able to meet their own basic needs. They're separated from their families. Again, they're operating in desperation. So, if you need a place to stay, you're going to need to have sex with me. Or they'll say things like, I promise I'm going to get married to you, and let's just go out of town. And when they get there, next thing you know, they're being asked to go truck to truck to truck to provide sexual favors in order to keep that hotel room that evening. So I think, again, young people who are runaway or homeless are most susceptible, most vulnerable to sexual exploitation just because of lack of resources and they're not connected with their families or other community members. Boys and girls. And I think this is the population, if you're looking at male sexual exploitation, domestic, underage, male sexual exploitation, runaway and homeless youth, again, are most susceptible. And they're being lured into sexual exploitation, by older men and women who have been homeless and who know the streets very well. They're being lured by different people posing as magazine sales companies. And then once they get them out of town, they realize that this is a perpetrator, this is a pimp, or a recruiter at minimum. Most chronic runaways, again, come from homes where they have experienced domestic violence, sexual abuse, physical abuse, drug and alcohol abuse in the home. And they have been brought up in a manner where they have been self-sufficient from a very young age. They're reliant upon themselves. Oftentimes, young people that we've worked with who are living on the streets when they're 15 and 16 were raising other baby brothers and sisters by the time they were 7 or 8. And it's easy to begin to blame them when we put them into a transitional living shelter or some kind of home, and they run away, and we say, see, we're offering you all these services, why aren't you accepting them? You must want to live on the streets, you must want to be involved in sexual exploitation. But again, we're not understanding the services and we're not applying the services in the context that, first of all, they've experienced significant trauma, and secondly, they have been taking care of themselves for as long as they can remember. Perpetrators are very smart. They know where vulnerable youth stay. They understand what a transitional living program is. They understand what a youth shelter is. And they will scout those places, and they will drive around, and they will watch for that young person walking to their job that they finally earned, and they'll watch that young person walking to and from school, and they will give their card. My name is Sir, you fill in the blank. I can help make you money. I want you. You look beautiful. You're really smart. You got a thing going on, girl. Or you can make a lot of money, boy. And so I think it's critical for social service providers at all levels, policymakers, law enforcement officers to understand that they need to sell their services too. They need to be driving around, scouting those kids and selling themselves and trying to work hard to establish a relationship with young people who are very vulnerable and marginalized. Because again, if we're not handing out our card, if we're not spending time with that young person, somebody else will be, and it'll be the perpetrator.
And build relationships. A lot of the way that we get to the kids that need us is through other kids and referrals. So making contacts with kids that are in the areas that we know their needs, and then we bring physical supplies as well. So finding out what kids actually need, and if you have something you can give, it's a door in, it's a way in. We pass cards out, so a lot of our night tonight will be walking up and down the streets, just passing cards out to kids that we see, and that's also a door into their lives. So helping provide services doesn't usually happen overnight, but the initial contacts are very important.
So Minnesota's human trafficking law right now is a fabulous, progressive human trafficking law. It really has taken, I think, a great step forward in recognizing that prostitution and trafficking are one and the same thing. But prostitution remains a criminal offense in Minnesota, and if you are a child who engages in criminal activity, then you are considered a juvenile delinquent.
When you think about a girl who at the age of 11, 12, 13 was forced into prostitution, and from that point on has been beaten and threatened and brutalized every single day of her life, we had to ask legislators, does that girl wake up on her 16th birthday and consent to be raped and beaten every day of her life? And when legislators started to really think through it that way, it made more sense to them. The second issue that legislators would bring up a lot, and we've heard it phrased a lot of different ways, but what a couple of our legislative friends will tell you is, well, I believe in a carrot and a stick approach. And what we've had to say is, that's an interesting theory, but are you interested in being effective? Because any threat that the juvenile justice system can place on a 15-year-old girl is nothing compared to her trafficker telling her, I will kill your family if you testify against me. So even if you took morality out of it and you just wanted to be effective, it's not the right approach. And so what we've had to also tell people is, yes, a child may run from a program one time or two times or three times, but unless she sees a way out for herself, unless she can meet somebody and be in a place where she can trust people and feel safe, then she will never get out. The juvenile justice system does not provide a way out. And as long as she's stuck in that system, she won't get out. And so we've had to make that argument time and again too. And for the most part, it's been effective.
Yeah, well, it's been really, really critical for us to have a lot of conversations with people who are involved in the system right now. And before we even decided whether legislation was the right course of action or what we thought that should look like, we spent a lot of time talking both in big groups and in small conversations with kind of everybody who's involved with the system, with the service providers who deal directly with kids in prostitution, with the prosecutors, with the police who are out there every day trying to figure out what to do, with healthcare providers, with children's advocates, with law professors who know lots of things about our juvenile justice code, with a whole range of people, but particularly keeping our ears open to our law enforcement side. What we found was that we have some great law enforcement officers and prosecutors out there who are trying to really raise the standard.
The Minnesota Safe Harbor legislation does three things. The first thing it does is it removes the conflict in our law that allows sexually exploited children to be treated as criminals. It takes that off the table and it says plain and clear, in the state of Minnesota, we will treat sexually exploited children as children who need our protection, service, connection to the support they need. The second thing it does is it actually increases fines for the crime of adult prostitution. So an adult purchases another adult for sex. In Minnesota right now, a conviction for that crime gets you a fine of $250. That's a speeding ticket. And almost always that fine is waived in the end. And so it's no kind of deterrent. It doesn't go after the demand side at all. So what we do in this legislation is we actually triple that fine to $750. So that gets at the amount question, but what we also need to do is incentivize the application of this fine. And so that fine in our legislation is split between the arresting law enforcement agency to train their officers in how to deal with child sex trafficking cases. Part of it goes to the prosecutor, and then the rest of it will go into a fund to fund supportive services. So that's the second piece. The third piece of the legislation is really the expansion of a supportive model statewide. So in the Minnesota Safe Harbors legislation, we actually don't have an implementation date until 2014. And the reason we did that was to give service providers and law enforcement personnel, prosecutors, and everyone else, health officials, time to build out the ideal system, to build out a system that makes sense for survivors of commercial sexual exploitation. In the eyes of lawmakers and policymakers, they want you to tell them that you will go rescue this child, you will put this child in a program for 3 months, they will be rehabilitated, and they will go back to their life as a teenager in a normal life, like nothing ever happened. And so part of the education around this too, as we build these systems, is that these children show the same post-traumatic symptoms as torture survivors. And that's a lifelong process to deal with and to work through and to heal from. And so as we're building out these systems, we need people to understand that this isn't going to be a quick fix thing. It's not going to be a 12-week intervention and you've saved this child and they will be fine from this point on. It's going to take a variety of kinds of services, all the way from medical to therapeutic to counseling to whatever it might be, and it's going to be a longer amount of time. This is an issue that affects everybody. It's children from the suburbs, it's children from rural areas, it's children from every income level. This is everybody's issue to address. It's all of our children, and we need to step up together to address it.
So JDAI was established basically because the data indicated that we were locking up lots of low-risk youth unnecessarily and holding them typically in overcrowded juvenile detention centers, that simply worsened their odds of both further delinquency and poor success as they sought to make transitions to adulthood. Obviously, we were trying to solve the problem of unnecessary and inappropriate use of secure detention in the juvenile system, but we were also trying to influence that system overall so that it made smarter decisions about children, put them in less restrictive settings, and used its public funding in ways that did a better job of helping youth develop positively and protecting the public. What we have found makes a huge difference in terms of systems changing how they respond to children's behavior is to begin, first of all, not by focusing on the behavior of the kids, but rather to be focused on the behavior of the adults who work in and manage the system. That is, if we adults can't make smarter decisions in a more timely way with a wider array of options, expecting the children's behavior to change is simply naive, if not outright arrogant. So we begin by basically getting the people who work in the system to reconsider the decisions that they're making, the bases on which they're making those decisions, and the kind of options that they have available when faced with difficult decisions. And if you can change those things, you can change pretty fundamentally what happens to the kids, and then the potential for the kids' behavior to change is vastly improved. So if you look at the research, kids who are detained, all other things being equal, are more likely to have sustained delinquency careers. They're more likely to be confined if they're found guilty of being a delinquent. And of course, that will significantly influence their long-term life outcomes. So yes, there is a cycle, but the cycle is even more subtle than that. That is, youngsters who are detained are desensitized to detention. It's no longer a deterrent, and the court becomes desensitized to using detention in the lives of kids that it's previously detained. So kids who end up in detention, for example, are often separated from their schools and find it very difficult to get back attached to the school system, even though we know that poor school attachment is one of the worst risk factors a child can have in terms of future success. The evidence is very clear that youth who are detained are more likely to be formally charged, they're more likely to be adjudicated delinquent, and they're more likely to be removed from their homes if they are found delinquent than similarly situated kids. So being in detention puts you on a slippery slope to the system's deep end. And what we know about the system's deep end, its training schools, reformatories, other forms of at-home placements, is that being in those facilities makes it less likely that you will complete high school, makes it less likely that you'll be successful in the job market, makes it less likely that you'll form enduring families, makes it more likely that you'll have serious public health problems like abuse of drugs and alcohol or other kinds of infectious diseases, and makes it more likely that you will be a burden to the society in general in your adult years, either as a criminal ward of the state or as someone who has been unable to find a good connection to the labor market. I think that people in the justice system need to fundamentally reconsider how we deal with these cases. I think prosecutors need to reconsider whether, in fact, exploitation by the commercial sex trade is a sound basis for charging youngsters with delinquency. I think judges need to reconsider whether or not participating in the industry is a sound basis for finding youth delinquent. And I think we need, in general, a different kind of policy that separates these kids from the average delinquent and recognizes that the journey that they've taken to the juvenile court is a different one, marked by very different developmental experiences and requiring very different interventions than the typical juvenile justice system can provide. If what we want is for these kids to have healthy futures and for society to have less of a commercial sex trade in which kids are exploited and society generally is negatively affected, then what we need to do is cut these careers short by recognizing that the kids are victims and that we need a different approach to helping them get back on track. Putting them into juvenile jails, holding them accountable as we would people who burglarize homes or stick guns in people's faces just doesn't make sense as a matter of public policy.